Hello. Today we are going to be reading an Italian folktale called The Dragon with Seven Heads. There's a few interesting twists and turns in this one, so I hope you enjoy it. There was once a fisherman whose wife bore him no children, even though they had been married for some time. One day the fisherman took his nets to the nearby lake to fish and caught a big, beautiful fish. The minute it was pulled out of the water, the fish began begging the man to let it go, promising in return to tell him about a pond in the region where he could make a much finer haul and in no time at all. Hearing the fish talk frightened the fisherman, and he didn't hesitate to free the fish, which immediately disappeared into the water. The fisherman went to the pond and caught so many fish in 2 or 3 hauls that he returned home more loaded down than a donkey. His wife insisted on knowing how he had caught so many fish, so he told her in detail what had occurred. At that, the woman was furious with her husband. "You fool! How could you let such a fine fish get away? Be sure to catch it tomorrow and bring it home. I intend to prepare it in a stew that will really satisfy our craving for fish." To please his wife, the fisherman returned to the lake the next day, cast his net, and again pulled up the talking fish. But this time also he yielded to the fish's pleading and spared it, then made a splendid haul in the same pond as yesterday. Then he came home and told his wife, who flew off the handle, put her hands on her hips, and blessed him out. "You dumb ox, you blockhead! Can't you see you're cursed with luck? How can you turn your back on it? Either you bring that fish home tomorrow, or you'll be sorry you didn't. Is that clear?" Dawn found the fisherman back at the lake. He cast his nets, pulled them up, and there again was the big fish, whose words and entreaties this time fell on deaf ears. The fisherman ran straight home, and his wife took the fish, which was still alive, and threw it in a tub of fresh water. Then they both stood by the tub admiring the fish and discussing the best way to cook it. At that, the fish poked its head above the water and said, "Since I can't get out of this, let me at least make my testament." The fisherman and his wife consented, and the fish said this: "When I'm cooked and halved, let the woman eat the meat, the mare my broth, and dog my head, and plant the 3 biggest fish bones in the garden. Hang my gallbladder from a beam in the kitchen. You will have children. Should any of them come to grief someday, my gallbladder will turn red." After cooking the fish, the 2 people followed its instructions to the letter. Then it came to pass the woman, the mare, and the dog all 3 gave birth on the same night. The dog had 3 puppies, the mare had 3 colts, and the woman had 3 babies. The fisherman was shocked. How about that? 9 new births in one night. The triplets were so much alike that it was impossible to tell them apart without a different emblem around each one's neck. As for the fish bones planted in the garden, they sprouted into 3 splendid swords. When the children became big boys, their father gave them each a horse, a dog, and a sword, and as a present from himself, a shotgun apiece. In no time, the firstborn grew weary of living at home in poverty and decided to go out and seek their fortune. The oldest mounted his horse, took up his dog, his sword, and his gun, and bid everyone farewell. To his brothers he added, "Should the gallbladder hanging above the beam ever turn red, come and search for me, for I'll either be dead or in serious trouble. Farewell," he added, and galloped away. After riding for days and days through unfamiliar territory, he came to the gate of a big city draped in mourning. He entered and found all the inhabitants grief-stricken and dressed in black. At an inn where he went for dinner, he asked the reason for all the black, and the innkeeper explained, "There's a dragon with 7 heads who comes down to the bridge every day at noon. If he is not given a maiden to eat, he will enter the city and devour everyone in his path. Lots are drawn daily. Today is the turn of the king's daughter, who must be on the bridge at noon for the dragon to devour. The king has posted a proclamation that the man who rescues her will be her husband." The youth said, "There must be some way to save the king's daughter and free the city from such a scourge. I have a powerful sword, a dog, and a horse. I would like to be taken to the king." Led to his majesty, the youth asked permission to confront and slay the dragon. "Young man, full of zeal," replied the king, "note that many men before you have tried and lost their lives. Poor wretches. If you feel like risking your life and conquer the dragon, you will have my daughter's hand in marriage and inherit the kingdom upon my death." Undaunted, the youth took his dog and his horse and went to sit on the parapet of the bridge. At the stroke of 12, here came the king's daughter, dressed head to toe in black silk with her retinue. When they were halfway across the bridge, the attendants burst into tears and turned back, leaving her there by herself. She looked around and saw a man sitting on the bridge with a dog. "Noble sir," she said, "what are you doing here? Didn't you know that a dragon is coming any minute to devour me, and that he will eat you too if he finds you here?" "I am well aware of that. I've come to set you free and marry you." "My poor man," answered the princess, "flee, or the dragon will have 2 souls to devour today instead of just me. He's a dragon full of wiles. How can you expect to slay him?" From just looking at the princess, the youth had fallen in love with her, and he said, "For the sake of your love, I will risk my life, and what will be, will be." They had just finished this discussion when the palace clock struck noon. The earth began to quake. A chasm yawned from the ground, and out sprang the dragon with 7 heads amid smoke and flames. He made straight for the princess, his 7 mouths open and whistling for joy, since he had noticed he would feast on 2 humans this day instead of 1. In a flash, the youth was on his horse and charging the dragon, as well as sicking his dog on the monster. Brandishing his sword, he swept off 1, 2, 3, and then 6 of the 7 heads, one after another, fell to the ground. Then the dragon asked to rest a while, and the youth, who was also out of breath, said, "Let us both rest a moment." But the dragon rubbed his 1 remaining head on the ground and came back up with the other 6 heads reattached. Seeing that, the youth realized he had to sweep off all 7 heads at once. He therefore rushed upon the dragon. They fought back and forth, tooth and claw and sword. He swung his sword mightily until over and over again, until exhausted and every single head was off and rolling on the ground. Then he took his sword and cut out the 7 tongues, asking the king's daughter, "Do you have a handkerchief with you?" The princess gave him her handkerchief, in which he wrapped the 7 tongues. He mounted his horse again and rode to an inn to wash and dress for his visit to the king. As luck would have it, in a hovel near the bridge lived a sly and wicked old coalman, who had witnessed the combat from afar. He thought to himself, "Let's outsmart this ninny who leaves dragon heads lying around and waste time getting all spruced up." He gathered the heads in a bag and ran to the king, brandishing a huge knife smeared with the dragon's blood. "Sacred crown," he exclaimed, "here before you stands the dragon slayer, and these are his 7 heads, which I cut off one by one with the knife you see here. Therefore, Sacred Crown, keep your royal promise and give me your daughter's hand in marriage." The king was quite taken aback at the sight of this sinister face. Not convinced of the truth of man's story, suspecting strongly that the zealous youth who had been devoured, and the coalman had shown up at the last minute when the dragon was already done for and dealt only the finishing stroke. In any event, the promise could not be altered, and the king was obliged to reply, "If that's how it really happened, then my daughter's hand is yours." At that, the princess, who had been in the audience hall listening to the conversation, began screaming at the coalman, saying he was a liar and that it wasn't he who had slain the dragon, but the young man who would arrive any minute. A heated quarrel followed, but the coalman stuck by his story, producing the heads in the bag as evidence. The king could not dispute it, and had no choice but to order his daughter to calm down and to prepare to wed the coalman. Right away, the king ordered the announcement made public. 3 days were devoted to festivities, with a grand banquet on each day, at the end of which period this wedding would be celebrated. In the meantime, the real dragon slayer arrived at the royal palace, but the guards at the front door refused to admit him under any circumstances. In the same instant, he heard the town crier going through the city squares announcing the forthcoming wedding of the princess and the coalman. The youth argued in vain to be taken to the king, but the guards were not to be moved. Finally, the coalman appeared and ordered the young man thrown out at once. The youth, therefore, had no choice but to return to the inn, seething with rage, and to think of a way to prevent that marriage, expose the coalman's lie, and establish himself as the real slayer of the dragon. At court, the table was laid, and all nobility invited. Seated next to the princess was the coalman dressed in velvet. And since he was short in stature, 7 cushions were placed under him to make him look a little taller. After racking his brains at the inn, the young man woke his dog, sleeping at his feet, and said, "Listen, faithful, run to the palace to the king's daughter. Make a fuss over her and her alone, no one else. And when they are all ready to sit down and eat, upset the table and flee. But be careful not to get caught." The dog, who understood everything his master had said to him, ran off, found the princess, and put his front paws in her lap, whined, and licked her hands and face. She recognized him, and was quite glad to see him. Stroking his ears, she whispered in his ear, and asked where her rescuer was. But the coalman was suspicious of all those caresses, and ordered the dog driven out of the banquet hall. They were just serving the soup, so the dog caught hold of a corner of the tablecloth, and pulled it clean off the table on it, thus littering the floor with broken dishes and soup everywhere. Then he flew down the stairs as fast as he could, so that no one could catch him, or even see which way he went. The confusion of the guests was too much for words. The banquet had to be called off, which caused something of a scandal. When the second banquet came up, the youth said to his dog, "Go back, faithful, and do the same thing over again." Seeing the black dog, the princess laughed for joy, but the coalman, fearful and suspicious, insisted that the dog be driven out again. The princess, however, stood up for the dog, and the coalman, in spite of his meanness, dared not defy her. This time, too, as the soup was served, the dog grabbed hold of the tablecloth and pulled everything onto the floor again, and fled like lightning. Guards and servants chased after him, but he was out of sight before they came anywhere near him. Just before the third banquet, the young man said, "Go back, faithful, and do the same thing once more, but this time, let them follow you home to me." The dog did just as he was supposed to, and here came the guards on his heels right into the room of the young man, whom they seized and carried to the king. The king recognized him. "Aren't you the man who wanted to rescue my daughter from the dragon?" "I certainly am, your majesty, and to rescue her I did." At those words, the coalman shouted, "It is not so! I killed the dragon with my own 2 hands. To prove it, I brought along the 7 heads," and he ordered the 7 heads laid at the king's feet. Without losing countenance, the youth turned to the king, saying, "Maybe he brought the 7 heads. They were so heavy after the long battle that I brought only the tongues. Let's look in those 7 mouths and see if there's a tongue in each one." The 7 tongues were missing. Then the youth pulled out of his pocket the handkerchief in which were wrapped them, and described the combat in detail. The coalman refused to concede defeat, claiming the tongues would have to be put back in place to be sure they fit. Every time a tongue went in exactly right, he flung one of the cushions off his chair in anger, and when it got to the 7th tongue, he disappeared under the table and fled. But he was soon caught and thrown in the dungeon by order of the king. Now, in the highest spirits, the king, bride, and the guests sat down to feast and conclude the marriage. Then night fell and everyone went to bed. At dawn, the youth rose, opened up the window, and seeing a forest full of birds and game, felt the urge to go hunting. His wife begged him not to go, as the forest was enchanted, and whoever entered it never came back home. But the more the youth heard, the more he was tempted by the danger. So he took horse, dog, sword, gun, and departed. He had already shot many birds when a violent storm arose, with thunder, lightning, and rain by the barrels. Soaking wet, the young man, who had already strayed in the darkness, then enveloping the forest, spied a cave and took shelter in it. It was full of white marble statues in various postures, but the youth was too tired and wet to pay much attention to them. He raked up some dry wood, and with the aid of his flintlock, lit a small fire to dry out his clothes and cook the birds. In a little while, an old woman entered the cave seeking shelter. She was drenched through and through, her teeth chattering, and she begged the youth to let her warm up at his fire. "By all means, ma'am," he replied. "You can keep me company." The old woman sat down and offered the youth salt for the roasted birds, brawn for the horse, a bone for the dog, and grease to grease his sword. But the minute the youth, the horse, and the dog ate, the sword was greased. They all froze into statues. Waiting in vain for her husband to return, the princess gave him up for dead, and the grief-stricken king ordered the city draped in mourning once more. Meanwhile, back at the fisherman's house, from the time the firstborn son had left, his fathers and brothers looked daily at the gallbladder hanging from the beam. One day, they found in the kitchen, the gallbladder had turned red. At that, the second son said, My big brother is either dead or something terrible has happened to him. I'm going to go out to look for him. Farewell." He mounted his horse and with his sword, dog, and gun, galloped off. All along the way, he stopped to ask people if they had seen his brother. "Have you seen a man who looks exactly like me?" Everybody laughed. "What a fine joke! Aren't you the same one who rode through here some time ago?" So the youth realized his brother too had come this way, and he continued in the same direction. He came to the royal city, where he saw people dressed in black. And when the people saw him, they marveled. "Here he is! Here he is! He's not dead after all! Hooray! Long live our prince!" They took him before the king, and the whole court, including the princess, took him for the firstborn. The king scolded him at great length for going off, and the second-born, without seeming puzzled, apologized, making up with the princess as well. So cleverly did he handle the questions and answers that he learned all about his brother, his marriage, and his disappearance. That night, on going to bed, the second-born took off his sword and placed it blade upward in the middle of the bed, telling the princess they would sleep on one side and one on the other. The princess didn't understand why, but they went to bed and fell asleep. He too rose at dawn, and right away opened the window, seeing the forest before him. He said, "I shall go hunting there." "Isn't one narrow escape enough for you?" replied the princess. "Must I suffer more anxious moments?" Her words fell on deaf ears, and he left with horse, dog, sword, and gun. He met with the same fate as the firstborn, and thus remained in the cave as a statue. Waiting in vain for him to return, the princess felt certain he was dead this time, and once more the city put on mourning by order of the king. Back at the fisherman's, meanwhile, the kitchen had turned red once more, looking upon the red gallbladder hanging there. The third-born set out at once in search of his brothers, taking his dog, his sword, his shotgun, and galloping off. He, too, inquired along the way, "Did you see two young men, each who look exactly like me, riding around here?" "What a clown you are!" exclaimed people. He stopped. "Are you going to come by here and ask the same thing every day?" So the third-born knew he was on the right road and kept on until he reached the city, where he was joyously welcomed as if he had just risen from the dead. He too was taken for the firstborn by the king, the princess, and the entire court. Like his brother, he went to bed at night with the princess, putting the sword in the middle of the bed and sleeping on one side of it and her on the other. Seeing the forest from the window in the morning, he announced, "I am going hunting." Again the princess was thrown into a state of dismay. "Are you bent on going to your doom? Do you love me no better than that? Every time you go hunting, I am worried to death about you." But the third-born was dying to be off in search of his brothers and left immediately. Taking shelter in the cave, out of the storm, he examined the statues one by one and recognized his two brothers. "There's mischief here for sure," he said to himself. "So I shall watch my step." He had just lit the fire and put on the birds to roast when the old woman appeared, and bowing and scraping, asked to warm herself by the fire. But the youth scowled. "Don't come near, witch. I want you nowhere near me." Appearing hurt by such a welcome, the old woman whimpered, "Have you no love for a fellow human being? I would still like to give you a few things to improve your supper. Salt for the birds, brawn for the horse, bone for the dog, and even grease to keep your weapons." The brother thought for a moment and said, "Why don't you try the bird first?" The old woman declined. "Brawn for the horse. Do you want to try the broth?" the brother asked. The old woman still declined, saying she wasn't hungry. He took the bone from the dog and held onto it for a moment. And then when she offered to grease the sword, he took the grease and threw it back. "Poor old hag, you're not going to catch me too," he cried, and pounced. He gripped her and unsheathed his sword, threatening to do her in if she did not help release his brothers. "You're an awful old witch. Give me back my brothers." The old woman protested that she had never harmed a soul, but menaced by the youth's sword, she finally confessed her witchcraft and promised to obey him if he would spare her life. She immediately pulled a jar of salve from her pocket to restore the statues to life. The brother wasn't about to let her go. With his sword in her back, he forced her to daub the statues, so one by one, all the statues turned back into living persons. And the cave was now full of people. When the brothers saw one another, they joyfully embraced, while the other men were speechless with gratitude toward the third-born. In all the turmoil, the witch was slipping away when the brothers ran up and caught her, taking her back to the palace to go into the dungeon. Now the spell of the forest was broken, and the firstborn carefully pocketed the jar of salve which brought the dead back to life. Returning to the royal city together, the men got to talking, and the brothers told one another about what had happened. At news his brother had slept with a princess, firstborn was thrown into a rage and slew his two brothers. No sooner had he committed the crime than he repented and pointed his own sword upon himself. The other noblemen restrained him and reminded him about the jar of salve. He anointed his brothers' wounds, and they stood up again as hale and hearty as ever. Overjoyed, the firstborn begged their forgiveness, which they granted, mentioning the sword in the middle of the bed, which they had not had a chance to speak of earlier. The three of them continued on until they reached the palace of the king. They called the princess, who nearly cried her eyes out. Seeing the triplets, she couldn't for the life of her say which one was her husband. The firstborn finally identified himself and introduced his two brothers. The king married the two men to two of the daughters of the noblemen which they had freed, naming them courtiers, and even invited the old fisherman and his wife to the palace.